The sun at Columbus Air Force Base had already started to cut through the morning haze when the cadets gathered on the edge of the tarmac. It was just after 0730, or 7:30 a.m., and the air hung heavy with expectation. The simulation exercise was routine. Each cadet took a turn running through the T-6 Texan II pre-flight emergency protocols. Nobody expected trouble, especially not during Elise Monroe's turn. She moved through the cockpit steps smoothly, headset on, eyes scanning the HUD. Then she paused. Her right hand hovered just above the throttle. Something didn't sit right. The readings were off. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but wrong. She called it out, calmly, then stopped the sequence. Behind her, a beat of silence. The supervising instructor blinked. Technicians exchanged glances. Cadets shifted their weight, murmuring. Then came the sound of approaching boots. Fast, heavy. Colonel Marcus Kane stepped forward without hesitation. His jaw locked tight. A silver eagle gleamed on his chest. His voice was loud enough to silence every breath on the flight line. He asked if she was quitting the sim. She said no. She'd flagged an irregularity on the HUD, possible software echo. He cut her off, called it hesitancy, over-analysis, said hesitation in the air costs lives. Then he turned and walked toward the shade tent. For a moment, it seemed like that was it. Just another cadet reprimanded for playing it too safe. But he came back with something in his hands. It was a galvanized steel bucket, half full. Beads of cold condensation clinging to the sides. Without ceremony, he stood in front of Elise and tipped it forward. The water hit her like a slap, soaking her uniform, running down her neck, into her boots. Gasps rippled through the group. No one moved. No one dared. Kane said the flight deck doesn't care about data points. It rewards instinct. He told the cadets that they had to learn to trust their gut. Then he walked away. Elise didn't flinch. She didn't speak. Water dripped from her jawline and fingertips as she stood beside the aircraft. Her eyes stayed forward. Her breath stayed steady. If she felt anything, it didn't show. Some cadets looked away, uncomfortable. Others watched her with something else in their eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or the first flicker of respect. That morning didn't end her. It didn't even shake her. Something in her seemed to anchor deeper, not break. By 8:15 a.m., the sun had dried most of her uniform, but nothing washed away the moment. Not for her. Not for anyone who saw it. Columbus Air Force Base was built for rhythm. Everything moved in measured cycles. Reveille sounded at 5:30 a.m., followed by formation, breakfast. Then another 12 hours of repetition, pressure, and performance. Inside the undergraduate pilot training program, there was little room for uncertainty. Reflexes were prized. Hesitation was punished. Cadet Elise Monroe didn't quite fit that mold. While other cadets thrived on adrenaline and cockpit confidence, Elise kept her head down, her hands steady, and her notebook open. She wrote constantly, after every sim, every sortie. She filled page after page with flight data, angles of bank, response curves, and reaction sequences. Where others ran on instinct, she ran on analysis. It wasn't that she didn't move fast. She just believed there was value in understanding what happened after the fact. That made her useful in the long term, but invisible in the short. Cadets noticed. Most didn't say much. A few rolled their eyes behind her back. Some called her robot or systems check. One even joked that if the aircraft ever lost power, she'd try to reboot it with math. But she didn't react. She never did. That, in its own way, made them uncomfortable. There were exceptions. A couple of classmates saw the way she mapped her approaches and respected it, quietly, but even they didn't sit with her at chow. Elise kept to herself, not out of pride, just habit. Colonel Marcus Kane, the commanding officer of the UPT program, had no patience for her kind of thinking. He was a decorated A-10 Warthog pilot, with hundreds of combat hours, most of them logged low and fast over Afghan valleys. He didn't trust theory. In his world, success came from snap decisions and nerves of steel. Flight, to him, was war in motion, and war didn't wait for analysis. He watched Elise with the wariness of a man who's seen hesitation kill. He didn't yell often, but when he spoke, cadets listened, especially when it came to instinct. Trust it, honor it, rely on it. That was Kane's mantra. In that kind of system, Elise wasn't just an outlier. She was a question no one wanted to answer. And in a culture built around certainty, questions didn't last long. At 10:45 a.m., the sky over Columbus Air Force Base was clear, but the radios buzzed with tension. Cadet Richter had just taken off in a T-6 Texan II for a routine climb-out when the stall warning lit up mid-ascent. His voice cracked through the channel. It wasn't panic. Not yet. But close. Inside the supervisor of flying station, Elise Monroe stood behind the primary monitor. She wasn't on duty. Not officially. But she always stayed close when others flew. She watched Richter's climb angle, altitude, wind speed. Then she saw it. The numbers didn't track. Not the way they should. The pitch wasn't steep enough to trigger a stall. The airspeed drop didn't match the profile. Her eyes narrowed. Most of the room assumed it was pilot error or hesitation. Elise knew better. She moved fast, grabbed a dry erase marker, and started sketching on the nearest whiteboard. Wind direction, torque, delay. She referenced telemetry on the secondary feed. Then she spoke to the instructor by the radio. Calm but firm. Recommend throttle back 5%. Nudge pitch up 2 degrees. It's likely a FADEC lag. If he yanks the stick, he'll spin it. The instructor hesitated, then relayed the call. Up in the air, Richter adjusted. The stall warning stopped. The climb stabilized. Breathing on comms returned to normal. 5 minutes later, the plane touched back down without incident. In the observation room, no one spoke at first. A few glanced at Elise. One cadet nodded. Barely. Another murmured something about good catch, but the silence was broken by Colonel Kane's voice as he entered, slow and cold. He'd watched it unfold from across the runway. He said nothing about the whiteboard. Nothing about the decision. He just looked at Elise and said that sometimes people get lucky. Then he turned away. Elise didn't react. Not outwardly. She capped the marker and wiped the board clean. Behind her, a few cadets lingered longer than usual, watched her more carefully. No applause. No high fives. But something shifted. She didn't need the credit. What mattered was that the system had failed, and she hadn't. By 11:15 a.m., Richter was back on the ground, unaware how close he'd come. Elise returned to her notebook. The pages already open. She wrote something down, then underlined it. Once, quietly, at 0600 hours sharp. The flight schedule was updated. Cadet Elise Monroe had been slotted for a solo evaluation under IFR training. She noticed the line item immediately. Triple phase sortie. No CREEF support. Auxiliary landing field. No one said it. But everyone knew what this was. She suited up in silence, ran her checks, and climbed into the T-6 Texan II without a word. The morning fog was thick. Visibility on takeoff barely cleared minimums. The tower cleared her at 07:15 a.m. or 7:15 in the morning. She rolled down the runway, took off smooth and straight, disappearing into low cloud cover in less than 5 seconds. The first phase was textbook steady IFR navigation. No deviation. Perfect adherence to headings and altitude. The second phase hit mid-flight. Simulated system faults blinked across her display. While pressure fluctuation. En data freeze. Auto trim drift. Most cadets would have panicked or overcorrected. Elise didn't. She flipped to manual control. Stabilized pitch by hand. recalibrated the nav manually, and rerouted her own path to account for the failures. Then came the emergency, a diversion to Auxiliary Field 7, known by cadets as the sandbox. Short runway, crosswinds, unfamiliar terrain. She executed the approach with deliberate control, flared early, and touched down with a margin of error so tight the flight data later flagged it as ideal. Her time on the ground clocked in at 42 minutes and 16 seconds. The limit had been 40 minutes even. Colonel Kane was already on the tarmac. Arms crossed, eyes hard. The squadron had gathered, unofficially summoned. Kane walked up slow, boots thudding on the pavement. He didn't acknowledge her landing, didn't ask for the flight report. He just called out her number and said she had failed to meet the standard, not mission capable. Too slow, too theoretical, overthought everything. Elise stood there, sweat clinging to her flight suit. Her breathing was still shallow, but her voice was calm. She said the additional time was due to a systems failure simulation and that her priority had been airframe integrity and crew survivability. Even in simulation, that's what she'd been trained for. That's what mattered. Kane shook his head and turned to the others. He said flying was about instinct. He said hesitation kills. The cadets said nothing. Some looked down. A few glanced at Elise. Her face gave away nothing. No anger, no shame. She stood at attention until dismissed. Then she turned, walked back across the tarmac, and disappeared into the hangar. Behind her, the silence said more than Kane's speech ever did. The night after her evaluation flight, Elise Monroe didn't speak to anyone. She returned to her quarters, laid her flight suit across the chair, and opened her notebook. By 0900 the next morning, she had compiled a 15-page technical analysis of the flight profile, system faults, and environmental variables. She didn't title it as a grievance or request for review. At the top, it simply read, Recommendations for Training Systems Optimization. Her writing was clinical but thorough. She documented the FADEC delay she encountered, cross-verified with archived telemetry logs. She included weather data pulled from base radar, highlighting discrepancies between the real wind shear and the sim conditions programmed into the scenario. She mapped the decision tree she followed from the cockpit, showing how each action corresponded with established flight safety protocol. She even cited procedures from the official T6 Texan 2 operations manual. Then she submitted it, not to Kane, not to her flight lead. She sent it directly to the office of Lieutenant Colonel Vargas, the regional head of technical operations, whose name she'd only seen in a briefing memo 3 weeks earlier. She didn't expect a reply. 3 days later, at 14:45 p.m., or 2:45 in the afternoon, a black SUV rolled onto the flight line. Out stepped 3 officers from the Regional Command Review Board. By 1600, a classified meeting was scheduled in Briefing Room Delta. Elise was on the roster. Kane wasn't. When she walked in, the room was already half full. Men and women in uniform, some with ribbons she didn't recognize. She carried her notebook under one arm and a dry erase marker in her hand. She was told she had 20 minutes. She didn't ask for more. She drew the course profile from memory, then the wind layers, then the data points from her onboard diagnostics. Her hand moved fast but steady. She explained the misalignment between the sim training model and real-time aircraft performance. She showed how the emergency diversion logic had been based on a timing model that favored risk over safety margin. Her voice never rose. She never blamed anyone. By the time she stepped back from the board, the room was silent. One officer leaned in and asked her to explain her throttle adjustment again. Another requested a copy of the telemetry overlay. Lieutenant Colonel Vargas, seated in the back, just watched. Then he nodded once and made a note. Elise didn't smile. She didn't look for approval. When the meeting ended, she erased the board and left the room as quietly as she had entered. She never called it payback. But the next week, The training parameters for solo evaluations were officially put under review. No one said her name out loud. Not yet. But people were starting to ask who she was. The day after her whiteboard session, Elise Monroe was called into a conference room on the second floor of the operations building. It was just past 1100 hours, or 11 o'clock in the morning. Inside, the air felt still, not tense, not hostile, just quiet. Around the table sat senior officers, many of whom she had seen before but never spoken to. For the first time, they had questions, not challenges, questions. They asked her to explain how her model of evaluation worked. She didn't bring a speech. She brought a method. She walked them through how predictive flight systems, mental workload thresholds, and phase-specific checklists could be taught alongside traditional emergency procedures. She spoke clearly, never rushed. She framed everything around safety and mission performance, not ideology, not ego. At no point did she mention her solo flight. Not once did she refer to the criticism or the cold water or the label Kane had given her. She didn't have to. The work stood on its own. Each chart she drew, each connection she made, slowly shifted the room, not with applause, not with praise, but with quiet attention, real, earned attention. By 11:45 a.m., one of the commanders leaned back and nodded. Another asked for her permission to share her model with a partner unit. She agreed without hesitation. As the meeting closed, Elise offered one last point, a sentence so simple it felt like something she had carried for years. Instinct isn't born from nothing. It's built on patterns. And patterns come from understanding. There was no reaction at first, just silence. Then a few heads nodded slowly. A colonel glanced down at his notepad and underlined something. The room didn't erupt. It shifted. Permanently. Elise didn't stay after. She didn't linger. She walked out the way she walked in. Steady. Measured. And this time, noticed. The auditorium at Columbus Air Force Base was filled with quiet formality. It was 1100 hours sharp, or 11 o'clock in the morning. Graduation day. Uniforms crisp. Faces forward. The program moved on schedule. Names called. Hands shaken. Protocol followed. Then came an unscheduled pause. A senior commander stepped to the podium. He called forward Cadet Elise Monroe. A few heads turned. Most weren't expecting her name. She stood, walked to the front, and halted at attention. The commendation was short. Acknowledgement of technical excellence and contributions to curriculum reform. Her name was met with measured applause. Then, just as she turned to return to her seat, movement drew the room still. Colonel Marcus Kane stood. He didn't speak, didn't ask permission. He walked slowly to the center aisle and faced her. The entire squadron watched, unsure of what was unfolding. He held her gaze. Then, in full view of cadets and command, he raised his hand in salute. It was not casual, not reluctant. It was precise, a full, formal salute. After a beat, he spoke. Quiet, barely above the air systems humming overhead. He said he had misjudged her, and that warriors do not all look the same. Then he lowered his hand and stepped back. No one moved at first. Then one cadet stood, then another. One by one. The class followed. Every cadet in uniform came to their feet and held the salute. There were no cheers, no music, just silence thick enough to feel. Elise didn't smile. She returned the gesture, then sat down. It lasted less than a minute, but it changed everything. 1 year later, the flight line at Columbus Air Force Base looked the same, but something beneath the surface had shifted. Inside the training center, new cadets moved through revised protocols. Their coursework now blended emergency maneuver drills with problem-solving simulations. Instructors encouraged not just instinct, but situational awareness and structured thinking. There was room now for questions, for observation, for cadets who needed a moment to understand before acting. In the main hallway, a framed sketch hung beneath glass. Black marker lines, wind vectors, system delays. The original whiteboard diagram from Elise Monroe's briefing, it wasn't labeled with fanfare. Just a small plaque, efficient, clear. Down the corridor, Elise moved quietly between classrooms. Now a technical integration officer. She worked behind the scenes, refining curriculum modules and monitoring data feedback from simulation runs. She still carried a notebook, still wrote more than she spoke. That afternoon, at 14:20 p.m., or 2:20 in the afternoon, a young cadet approached her near the briefing deck. He looked nervous, not about flying, about asking. He said he knew her story, or pieces of it, then asked how she had found the courage to keep going, to stay herself in a place that once didn't want her to be. Elise looked at him, thoughtful, then smiled, soft but steady. She said it wasn't really about courage. It was about knowing who you are and staying grounded in that truth, no matter the wind. The cadet didn't say much after that, but he nodded, and he stood a little straighter when he walked away. Elise watched him go, then turned back to the flight logs she'd been reviewing. Outside, the sound of a T-6 engine hummed in the distance. Training continued. And so did she? Not above it all, just quietly. And lastingly, within.